Buenos días.
¿Cómo está?
Biblioteca.
Aeropuerto?
Sí.
Gracias.
Airporto.
Aeropuerto. You can see it took me like a half hour to figure out how to say airport in
Yes.
Spanish, and all you really have to do is add an O onto the end. I still couldn't do it.
Yeah, so that's the fancy word for what that is called a cognate. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but cognate is like a word that like looks the same and kind of sounds pretty much the same in your language. So like airport, airpuerto. I'm like, oh, I can look at that and be like, yeah, that's airport.
Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty good with those.
Taco.
Yeah. Wait a second.
Yeah, I mean, in English, taco is folded fried corn shell filled with meat and cheese.
Oh, that totally maps over. Cognate. Totally. It's almost exactly the same.
Good morning, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 4th, 2022.
Whew. We made it.
We made it. It's been 4 days. Dude,
Yeah.
2022 sucks. Let's get into next year already.
I know. This year has been such a drag.
I know. I mean, it's time for a new pandemic already. Like this old one,
Is that
so
what-
out of fashion.
So out of fashion. Yeah. We just, yeah. The new black is,
Look, all I gotta say is like, I was dealing with Corona before it was cool, and now I'm way past.
you're so hip. Have I ever told you how
as,
hip you
as
are?
a trendsetter in infectious diseases, you always got to be on the cutting edge.
And that's you.
The
Yeah,
things you
just-
gotta lick to stay on the edge.
What is your protocol for being like ahead of the curve on
Well,
this?
you know, I'm glad you said ahead because it brings me back to my first inspiration, Ozzy Osbourne.
Oh.
Yes, you know, when he bit that bat's head off on stage, I knew. I was like, I'm forever gonna be a chaser. I'm always gonna be chasing that next ill.
Yeah, just finding any rodent you can, biting its head off, and just hoping, maybe.
Exactly. And, you know, and then it was followed up by the Beastie Boys that said, it's time to get ill. And I was like, amen, brothers. And I just kept getting these messages, and I'm like, this is what I need to do.
Yeah, we need to talk a little bit at one of these points about how you receive these messages.
I think I'm spot on.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like you're on fire today. You're revealing so many things about yourself.
The thing is about fire, you got to be careful because if you use too much, it will kill all of the germs, which makes chasing.
This is tough, right? Yeah, everything has to be super raw.
Yes.
I get it. And also, there's these festivals talking about you being such a hipster. These fire festivals.
Yes. That one was actually it was very peaceful. You know, no music, no food,
just like a rotten ham sandwich.
Yeah, a lot of rain.
I heard that somebody actually sold their ham sandwich from that.
I wouldn't doubt it was probably for like $1,000.
Yeah, it was maybe
with
like
that
an
crowd.
NFT of their ham sandwich was what they sold.
NFTs on Firefest. I wonder how the market is on those.
Yeah,
I
why
bet
not?
it pretty good. So yesterday we talked. What all did we talk about yesterday? I know we talked about the Matrix a little bit. you know?
Yeah. We covered. I think the major topic was goals. Something about goals.
Yeah. So we were talking about how do you start the new, or how do you start right? You know, how do you start that new year, new you, new goals, all that type of stuff. And we were saying, hey, all right, what does it mean to do that right or correctly? And I'm using air quotes for those who are audio only because that was one of the things we talked about was, you know, it's about not figuring out what's absolutely I guess that's got to be said in a British accent.
It's a little British there, yeah.
Absolutely. It just is the only way it comes out. Ever since at Ozzy, you know, it had some side effects. But absolutely correct or right. But what is right for you, right? Everyone's situation is a little bit different, right? And so what is important to you? What is prioritized for you? And using that as a lens as you're trying to become better or whatnot.
Yeah, which is always fun to think about because if you want to go any deeper on it, then you have to also think that our society sort of helps shape what we think is right and good, and so sometimes it's difficult to sort of unwind some of those things and really know what's good for you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't know if it's step 0, step 1, step 2, but it's definitely early on in the steps, which is recognizing how much you're being influenced and, you know, where your source of what is good and bad comes from, right? I mean, I think, again, as like us higher beings, adults, we're all like, yeah, I think for myself, I know, I believe what I believe because, and then once you get past that because, you're like, wait, Why?
Hang on a second. Yeah, yeah.
uh,
And which is scary. I mean, it's super scary to start having to pick apart all of your sort of ideologies and belief systems and the way you move through the world, because there's this. We spend a lot of time trying to figure things out so we can move through the world as sort of comfort and grace. And when you don't know, you tend to be just stumbling around,
yeah.
and that, it's embarrassing. It's a
Yeah.
little awkward.
And and it's okay to be influenced by all of this stuff, right? But it's just make sure you're aware that you're influenced, because if you're not aware, then that's even worse, right? It's like
Yeah.
one thing to be influenced and pushed in a certain direction as you know it's happening because you're aware, right? But
Right.
if you're not aware, then you're going to end up somewhere over here and you have no idea how you got there or why, right?
Yeah, but yeah, we had a couple of conversations about what's right for you, but also sort of how these goals are gonna be set out, or if you're gonna have any. We talked a little bit about dropping things as well. You don't always have to keep adding on. That was one point that was kind of made, and then you made a good point about not sort of considering this as a clean break. Like, this is a continuation, right? Just because you hit the new year doesn't mean all of a sudden everything stops and you have to start off all new habits and all new ideas again.
Right. And so we introduced, or probably reintroduced, to be honest, we talked about it a good bit on the show, is, making sure to not try and do all the things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to be better. Yeah, you're energized. That's great. But don't take that high, that energy, that let's go get it attitude and try and do all of the things, because if you do that, you're probably going to end up falling short on all of them. And then you're going to lose all that energy, and then you're not going to want to do any of it. So the better approach is to, hey, pick maybe you just one. That's okay to just pick one, and you can always build on it, right? But don't start out from the beginning with all of the goals to do all of the things, right? If that's just realistically not going to happen, like, especially if you're someone who struggles with this kind of thing, right? So that's a big thing, is like, hey, if this is something you've tried to do in the past and you've not done successfully, well, let's try a different way, right? And that's some of the other things that we talked about. So yeah, check out the episode yesterday for, we talked around a whole bunch of other things. And you have any last things you want to mention about that goal setting and that kind of process?
Maybe go watch The Matrix.
I was gonna say the next thing I wanted to ask about recap wise was tell me the couple of Matrix recap points from yesterday.
Yeah, I think one of them was to think of the show as an update of ideas and politics. Over 20 years, our society has shifted, and the movie shifts, I think, are trying to map out some things that are going on both politically and socially, and trying to also think about maybe even new forms of how our society functions. Which is, I think I was saying in there, I look a lot in movies at the bad guy as a way to figure out who is the bad guy that we see currently. Previously in the Matrix, they had a guy called the Architect who designed the system the Matrix that you were stuck in. And now they, of course, have an analyst, and the analyst helps control you, right? It helps you become normative. And so there is this idea of how do you become a unique individual whenever we're all being based around normative standards. Whenever they actually embrace your pain, they embrace your pathos and tell you, oh, we don't use the words like crazy here. We don't use, and they end up sort of moderating all of your desires into something that can be shaped back into society. So that's kind of an interesting idea to put out there in the show. And I found that to be kind of a complex one to think about, because of course we want to be normal, we want to be healthy individuals, but what does it mean to be a healthy individual?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's really good. And one of my big takeaways from that discussion was, all right, I need to go jump in and watch all the matrices, even if just to discuss, because I do think it would be a really interesting conversation for us to have. And I wanted to also point out, I think it's kind of a nice little tie-in that, hey, we were sitting here talking about how much society influences you and things like that, and culture and whatnot. Well, it's a cool little example. Like, hey, you take this snapshot from 20, 30 years ago, 20 years, I guess, and then now, and it's like, hey, look at what that movie is and was and talks about and how it was, and then look at this one, and, maybe to the naked eye, it's not going to be like, wow, those are crazy, completely different. But once you start to look back a little deeper, you can see some of those differences.
Yeah, and there's little things in the movie where I think previously it was man versus machine. Even though of course men had machines, but there were sentient machines and then normal machines, and so it gets complicated. Now some of the machines actually are working with the humans, so it's a with rather than against. So it's a way to attempt to get past binaries. And that's, of course, like a classic philosophical tradition is to recognize the binary and then move beyond it or subsume it. And so that's kind of a premise that starts running through the movie as well. And so you wonder sometimes if the directors have actually gone deeper into their philosophy or if this is just a movement of the times.
Yeah, and that's another thing too about like, all right, how much is this just art versus how much is also just part of the whole movie and that type of thing too, which is always a fun thing to say. It's like, all right, I know these people think this way because they've publicly said this, but how much of this is really them versus like, okay, they recognize that would play up well within the context of this framework, and so that's always fun to pontificate on as well. So I wanted to tie in a couple of other things real quick, just as a hey, we're going to talk about these in the future type of thing. So we'll link it once we do that. So Matrix made me think of video games, and you also talked about Architect. I want to talk about video games in the future, both from an aspect of why I like them and what with the value they provide, and also maybe in the same day, maybe not, just talking about different enjoyable hobbies that people have and skill-based hobbies and things like that, and the value of skill-based hobbies. And then another thing was talking about, I think video game is a cool lens to look at architecture and design through as well, especially when you get to things that are like role-playing games and open worlds, and then also when you get into VR, because people may not realize it, but those things are so open that one of the things that video game designers really have to be thinking about is, okay, how do we design this game to encourage the player to go certain ways or to do the things that we want them to do?
Yeah.
And I think it's a really cool topic. Obviously, you're not going to get into it right now.
No,
but
my mind instantly was like, oh, yeah, and then there's this one thing that I learned in architecture school.
Yeah,
and I want
exactly.
to jump in immediately because that's exciting.
And there's, some of it is literally having to do with the buildings and lighting and spacing and going from, big spaces to narrow spaces. And then some of it's obviously achieved through dialogue and character interactions and things like that. Some of it's literally just lights and guiding you in certain directions. So that's just a little bit of a teaser for a conversation I think would be a lot of fun from a guy who is been in video games basically all his life, and a nerd who knows some art and design stuff, I guess.
Oh yeah, that's me. Yeah, I'm the nerd.
Yeah. maybe nerd is the wrong word.
I don't know. It lines up pretty well.
Yeah, does
it? I try to work hard to cover it, but it's just really
it just keeps peeking out
in there. Yeah, it's the core of who I am.
Well, the other thing that you mentioned that ties in nicely to another topic is how yesterday, when we were talking about goal setting and things like that, we recognize that sometimes one of the steps you need to do, if not the first step, is to quit some of the things you're doing. And so we thought that would be a very apt topic for today. And there was something else that happened as well that kind of made that like, all right, we should really talk about that. And so we will talk about that here shortly, right after the intro. Helpful for life. Welcome to What the Hell is Water. I'm Reed Garcia, founder of Helpful for Life.
Ryder Richards, guy wearing a huge Superman t-shirt.
Because he is the man. That is super.
Yes.
I like how the
delusional is also should be. I should make my own t-shirts.
Speaking of design choices, I mean, man is really emphasized there.
Yeah, it's right up there on the pectoral.
Right on the boob.
Yeah, the man boob.
I like it. Yeah, the man boob.
My left man boob.
It's the best one they could have done. So, before we get into the topic we're going to cover today, I want to complain.
Yes.
Man, this weather in Texas, let me tell you, freaking 32 right now, and then it's going to be like 60 later today. I'm like, I can't decide, like, can I be comfortable in sweats, or am I, like, right now I'm kind of hot, but then it's like you go outside and you're kind of cold. It's like, man, it's just like, there has to be the worst place for weather in the world. Like, no one can be worse off than us.
No one. You know what I was really getting to me right there is when I was a young lad, I only had shorts. I wasn't privileged to have sweats.
When you walked uphill both ways in the snow.
Yeah, only wearing newspapers wrapped around my feet.
But they were only black and white newspaper because we couldn't afford the color.
We couldn't afford color newsprint.
Yeah. So today we are going to talk about quitting. And depending on how well that conversation goes, it very well could go for the entire show, or maybe we'll decide to quit that topic and switch over to something else. So I'm not going to tease any other topics because we're going to see how this one plays out. So first off, when it comes to quitting, let's talk about all the things you can quit. Just real quick, let's just cover all the things you can quit, and then we'll kind of dive into some of them, right?
Yeah, I think quitting is the biggest one.
Yeah, Q squared.
Yeah. That's pretty common. I think I tried to quit sports at one point, and my dad told me that we don't have quitters in this family. I got that whole thing.
What was this around a tetherball, and you're just like, no, Dad. He's like,
they just kept hitting me.
Boom.
Oh, no.
Never quit, boy.
Yeah, no, we didn't even have a tetherball, so he would just.
Oh, that was just a state. I forgot.
We're so poor.
Those were the newspapers I used as shoes the day before.
Yeah.
Soggy and wet and smelly.
Slap.
Okay, so quitting sports, quitting hobbies,
Yeah.
that is one thing you can quit. Obviously, you can quit a job. That's probably, if I had to think, when someone says the word quit, and like you're doing word association, Family Feud, that's probably like 90% of people.
Yeah, quitting a job. Yeah.
Yeah. Another one is obviously, not obviously, but quitting a relationship or quitting a person, which I feel like that might be one of the harder things to do.
I can't quit you.
I'll never quit you. And then some of them could be habits too, right? And those could probably be the bad habits, hopefully, that you're quitting, and not the good ones. But there are some times where you recognize, like, hey, I know this is a good habit, but I'm going to choose to focus my time and energy on something else, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And another one is therapy. We talk a lot about, therapy and the value it provides and how we think a lot of people should try it, but we haven't talked about the flip side of when should you quit therapy, if ever, and what does that mean? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that a little later. Anything else that you can think about quitting?
No, those are some of the big ones. I'm sure as we talk a little bit more, we'll come up with others, but yeah, there's good habits, bad habits. There's all sorts of stuff. I do like there's jobs, relationships, and it's sort of this thing where as you move through the world, then we have so many things that probably we can't stop quitting just because of the way the world functions, which I think that's going to be something that we'll probably discuss a little bit as we move into this further. But there's some things it's almost impossible to quit.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, okay, just accept that. And then now what?
Yeah. And that accepting is an important part. And then there's also the things that are close to that, but not quite there, where it's like, hey, you feel like you can't quit this thing, but that's just a story you've been telling yourself. And it's like, okay, at least maybe it's worth doing that exercise. All right, what would I need to do to actually make this happen? And so that's something we could talk a little bit about as well. And I want to make sure to ask you guys, the chat, we want to hear from you. I know the downside of doing 7:30 in the morning is not everyone's up in Adam, especially if it's here on the West Coast and it's 5:30 in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
But we wanted to have this morning morning splotch. That's what we are. Morning splotch in your day. Cheeto dust. You're welcome. So we wanted to have this. We wanted to have this morning spot so people could have a good start to their day, and we want to hear from you guys. So let us know in the comments if you're here with us live. Let us know. Literally right now, you can influence this conversation. That's one of the unique things about having this show versus, say, something you watch on Netflix or a podcast you listen to, is that this is recorded live. I know everyone at home is like, man, these guys are really good at thinking these things up and writing these scripts, and they're so well spoken. Well, guess what? It's all off of the dome, people. This is an improvised show. We're just talking here.
Oh, wow.
And when I say yes, he says
he's going way off script.
Yeah.
Here. Just give me a
the
second.
teleprompter's broken.
Up. Yeah.
So please let us know in the comments, or you can go to our website, helpfulforlife.com, and hit the contact us button in the top right to let us know either something specific about this quitting topic or whatever's on your mind, and we would love to hear from you. So without further ado, I'm going to quit procrastinating, and we're going to jump right in. So when it comes to quitting, let's go ahead and talk about the easy one first. Jobs. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question, and it is, what was the hardest job for you to quit?
Oh, I think that was when I was a gallery director at Richland College. I was teaching there as well. So that was an interesting one because I was I thought at the time it was my dream job.
And in case it's relevant, you want to give a quick description of what gallery director is?
Yeah, the college had multiple galleries, and this is a college in
Art
Dallas.
galleries.
Yes, art
Yeah.
galleries, and so I would curate and run those galleries. So that means bringing in different artists or doing student-based shows or something like that. So between the two galleries, I do between 20 and 27 shows per year. And then we ended up actually finding other spaces and doing other kind of events with the college. So there's a lot of recruiting that goes on there. At the same time, I was teaching between 2 and 4 classes. So usually that's a full-time load for a professor. Is the community college, I think it's now 5 courses, but my friends at universities, like they teach like a 2-2 or a
Right.
2-1, which means 2 classes per semester or 1 class per semester, something like that. So it was a very intense job because between doing all the programming and trying to fit in all the work, then there's just a lot of things going on. So you're teaching, you're curating, you're bringing in these shows. What I really loved was getting to work with all the artists and really sort of helping them realize their vision. You kind of get to select from what's going on around you in the world and say, this is relevant, let's show this. And then the next month, you get to pull up some student artwork and say, this is what our students are doing. Aren't we proud of them? And aren't they doing exciting work? So there's a lot of that. I thought that was going to just sort of be my job for a really long time. But I was offered an amazing opportunity to go do an art residency that would last for a year. And I ended up leaving that job because I thought that they'd give me like a year-long deferral or something. But they were just like, nope, have fun. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm out. I guess I have to quit. And so, and that was quitting one opportunity for another opportunity.
Okay, so you really liked the job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was something you enjoyed doing, but you had another opportunity that came up that you basically like, I gotta do this.
Yeah, that was the way it felt at the time. It felt like that art residency was a once in a lifetime kind of award.
And which art residency was it? You
This
said?
was a Roswell
Okay.
Artist in Residence program. It's one of the few residencies where it's a year long. They give you a house and a studio and a monthly stipend.
Oh, nice.
So it's almost like your full-time job is just to make art for a year.
Yeah, and even even if that wasn't at the exact institute or whatever that you wanted, I mean, that seems like a pretty good type of situation for an artist, right?
Oh yeah, I think it's the dream, you know. So I've really enjoyed that, and so that was a tough one to quit. I mean, the Richland job was tough to quit, but I thought this opportunity was well worth it.
Okay, so that was a job that was difficult for you to quit. Was there, uh, I mean, did you regret it at all? Were you glad that you took the steps, or what were some of your feelings around that?
Yeah, no, I think there are things I regretted about the way the institution sort of handled it. I just thought that there could have been an alternate way to handle this. Bring in an interim for a year and then let me come back into the job. And the idea that that wasn't something they were willing to entertain, that left me with some hard feelings about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, about the whole like valuing and respecting your employees and that kind of thing is like, hey, if they really like me and respect me and think I do a good job, why would they not want to bring me back? Especially because, but I also get the flip side of it too, right? It's like, okay, well, if you're trying to hire someone for that 1 year in between, like, what's the sell to them? Like, hey, do this thing for a year, and obviously you could have the team pick up the slack, or you do bring in someone, but so I see both sides, but that I get that. So you quit, you went and did the new thing. When you're
Mm-hmm.
done with that residency, were you like itching to get back, or were you glad that, because I mean, in some ways that helped open you up to do the next thing, right?
Yeah, it did, and I ended up coming back and applying for a different job at a different community college in Dallas, and luckily ended up getting that job. So while I was in Roswell, went through an interview process with Eastfield College and ended up picking up a job there. And so that's all very lucky because I love it when I bump into people and they say something like, well, why don't you just get a job at this college? You're a great artist. And it's just like these jobs are so highly coveted because the world is saturated with people that have master's degrees in art that have no other way to make a living except for to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that I could even pick up a job when I needed it and it happened to be available, just super lucky, stars aligned. And so I was really grateful to get that job as well. But Yeah, I've been kind of lucky in the job cycles, and it's part of it is I like to think that I sort of work hard and
Yeah.
put in a lot of effort and am considerate, and that I actually care about things, and I think that some of that helps. But along the way, it's also the very competitive field.
Do you ever find that your superhuman strength, ability to fly, and laser eyes make a difference?
Well, during the interview process, on occasion, I can show my temper a little bit, and
Yeah.
yeah,
You ever like, hey, I can tell your coffee's a little cold. Let me.
let me warm that up for you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is just one of
that's
the
really
perks I bring to
yeah,
the job.
yeah. It isn't really my temper. It's really just my helpfulness
Yes.
around the kitchenette. That's what gets me hired. And it's like I
Uh,
don't want to use the microwave. Stare at me with those
There's
piercing
just
green
there's
eyes.
just a line just outside your cube, like,
Yeah,
all right,
coffee. Yeah, cookies.
so okay, so when you're talking about quitting, some of the things I hear are, okay, one, it's about what other opportunities might be there that either one are already there that I could take, or maybe what other opportunities are there that I can't take because of the thing that I'm doing right now. And in this case, maybe it's a job, but it could be other things as well, right? Recognizing that, hey, you know, not always when you quit is it gonna be like a, oh yeah, whoo, I'm done, it's free, I'm great. And honestly, arguably, if you get to that point, like some would maybe even say, hey, did you wait too long to quit? And it's like, if it's that
Yes.
obvious and that like bells are ringing everywhere, it's like, okay, well maybe you should have quit months ago.
Yeah, it's man, that's a tricky one. And so part of this math that goes into all this quitting is what are you going to do in the future? And is this opportunity so good you're going to give up your current stability? And when I'm talking about these job fields, especially in art being highly competitive, they're probably competitive in almost all fields now because we have so many highly educated people that all
Right.
need jobs. But at the same point, I it's just kind of like, wait, I don't know if it's going to be possible to jump from this job into another job like this because these are rare. This is a
Yeah.
very rare thing. So I happen to get lucky on all that, but I don't, man. Uh, Now when I think about it, it was just like I don't know how the stars aligned. I don't know how that all made sense and how I kept stayed employed after sort of dropping one amazing opportunity for another amazing opportunity, and then just like I kept sort of landing in these like amazing fields, and so yeah, I feel very lucky with that. But yeah, I have quit my jobs, and at the time they have been scary. Because you don't know what the next step is going to be or the next transition. Increasingly, I think more and more about that because I think as I get older, I get closer to this idea of needing retirement.
Mm-hmm.
And so there becomes this kind of precarity of the world of not knowing what you're going to do to survive because we don't have a social safety net that's really going to be great for you.
Yeah. So, another thing, obviously, you're hitting the nail on the head a lot with here is just the reality of being able to quit. And, some of that is what other opportunities are out there. Some of it is, how easily you'd be able to get those things. And then some of it's also just straight up financial and other factors like, all right, well, how am I going to put food on my table? And then
Yeah.
another one that comes with quitting, unfortunately, with this country is healthcare, right?
Yeah.
It's like if you're going to quit, like you're going to have to start paying for your own health insurance, or going on an assistance program that will help pay for some of it. But and depending on where you are in the economic spectrum, like that can be a really big deal,
Oh
especially
yeah.
for people who are, just above, they make enough to not be deemed poor by the government, but not enough to really sustain and live like a rich life, if you will. That's there's a term for that area, but that's a tough spot to be in. Because you quit and it's like, all right, well, they were paying for my healthcare, but now if I'm gonna do that on my own, it's probably gonna cost me maybe hundreds of dollars.
Mhm.
And then so yeah, so that's another big thing. So tell me about a job that you quit that it was a no brainer. Did you have any that were
Oh
kind of
yeah,
no
I
brainers?
worked at a retail job at one point that was like Michael's craft store in their
Yeah.
arts and framing section. And I used to work at a frame shop in a gallery in Fort Worth, which I really loved. It was called William Campbell Contemporary Art, and it was a fantastic experience. I worked there during and a little bit after graduate school, and so I was like, oh, I can do framing. So I went to Michael's, and I was like, I'll take a job as a framer here, and man, I hated that job. That was just an awful job. And it's one of the jobs that, you go, why are people so petty about such meaningless things? You go, oh, I have this much power and I'm going to use every bit of it to make your life miserable.
Yeah.
That was that job. And it was just like, so that was a no-brainer to quit.
Yeah. And I know exactly what you mean. Like sometimes you're like, really, that's where you're going to go. And it reminds me of a technique that I heard one time, which is repeat in a very neutral tone what someone is asking you to do back at them and say, okay, so what you're asking me to do is you want me to pick that up over there and you want me to go shake it out over there and then throw it over there and then hit myself on the head with it or whatever the thing is. I couldn't think of a good example, but you just say it in that neutral tone, like stated back to them, and then look them in the eyes and as you're saying it, and then make them be like, yes, that's what I want you to do. I was like, okay. And then you just have that kind of knowing nod and smile, and then just see if they keep doing that for you.
Oh, yeah. I ended up having a situation almost identical to that where somebody was telling me I needed to both be working the desk at the frame shop and putting all of the items out and stocking the shelves at the same time.
You can fly, dude. Come on.
I know. I'm so fast.
I know right now you're really in Clark Kent mode, but
yeah. So yeah, I don't know, man. There's the other thing is when you're not being paid and you're being given a lot of grief, and they keep changing your schedule arbitrarily just so you can't pick up a second or third job. Like you're just like, oh, this will never work.
Yeah. No, I have a friend who's in the hospitality industry, doing waiting, bartending, things like that. And he actually said, like, I'm intentionally not going full time because the people who go full time get treated the worst. Mm-hmm. It's like they get all the bad shifts, and they have all these types of things happen with power and all this type of stuff. It's like I intentionally am avoiding that. So I'm going to work part time. I'm going to pick up the shifts they can, and if they can't, then they know like those are the shifts I'm going to take because I need those, and I'm not full time, right? Yeah. And then I can go do other stuff, right? And I was like, it's an interesting approach. It has its downsides too, of course, but.
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of fascinating what we do for stability, and then once we have it, how we get treated.
Yeah, and that's the thing about a job is jobs have so much power over us, right? And not just the job, but the people involved. And also, since job can be very closely tied with identity, yes. When you start threatening that, it really gets that caveman brain and that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like protecting like my source of food, security, stability, all that type of stuff. And so that's what makes it a really hard thing to examine and acknowledge. So any other thoughts on jobs before we're going to talk more about quitting as a whole, but I want to maybe talk about some of these other things.
I would say that when I moved from being an art professor into being a creative director, I felt like I had given something up there. So that was part of this identity shift, was because to be an art professor had a certain cachet to it. And to be kind of a hired gun designer, it doesn't have the same sort of cachet.
Yeah, and that's another thing about quitting or changing a job that is very important for people to think about, which is, am I okay not going always vertically upwards? Because I think that's a thing that people really get in their mind. It's like, well, now I make this much money. I'm never going to accept a job less than that much money. Or, oh, my title is this, or my responsibility is this. I'm not going to step down to do that thing. And on one hand, I totally get that, totally respect it. And I'm not saying it's a bad way to think. But I'm also encouraging people to think and be like, hey, well, if you take that side step somewhere else, which could be within the same company, could be in another company, maybe it's transitioning to another field altogether, which is another big thing to talk about, which we won't be able to talk about in depth today, but just the idea of mid-career switching, especially as you start to get a little bit older, right? And it's a different thing when you're in your 20s and you're still fresh in your field, and it's like not as big of a deal to switch. But once you're like 5+ years in, it gets a lot harder because you have some momentum, you have some experience in that specific thing, and so that's another thing that goes along with quitting.
Oh yeah, and it's tricky. It's tricky to sort of like put all those pieces together and guess which one would be best for you. But there's sort of another philosophical thing that shows up where if you're considering it, you maybe have already made the choice. There's some part of you that already knows that something isn't working out in your current situation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be considering a change.
Right. And one thing to temper people so they don't all just go quit right now, which, if you want to, YOLO.
Go,
But is that accept that regardless of where you go work, regardless of what that job is, there's going to be some downsides to it, right?
Like every job will have a different set of challenges, and people do say things about, the devil, kind of stuff. But you know, it's worth balancing. Sometimes I also try to think to myself, do you want to live an interesting life, or do you want to live like a very stable, comfortable life? And I tell myself that I want to live an interesting life, but a lot of times my decisions are made around stability and comfort.
Yeah. Well, as Superman, I understand. You know, you need that stability.
Yeah, I do. I do. I need the Clark Kent thing is strong.
Exactly. But yeah, the idea of what opportunities could be there, right? You know, the whole phrase of like, whenever you know, close a chimney, it opens a window.
That's
no. Something like that.
Do you have a chimney in this apartment?
That would explain why I get so sleepy all the time.
You just keep lighting fires in here without opening anything.
Carbon monoxide poisoning. Great.
The good times.
Great.
Fun
No,
as hell.
you know, I couldn't remember the exact phrase, but something about like, you know, opening doors, and you never know the opportunity that's just around the corner if you're never walking around the block, right? So that's part of it too, is like by being open to doing something new and trying something different, like who knows where your life could go, right? If I were to say, hey, Reed, guess what? When you grow up and be a big boy, you're gonna host a live stream television show every weekday morning. And oh, by the way, you're not a morning person. We're gonna do it every morning at 7:30 a.m.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, none of that even like resonated at all with me until, you know, maybe the last 9 months.
Yeah, no, I think it's also fascinating how we change over time, right? We think we're not a morning person until we then have to do it. And then after a while, you're just like, this isn't so bad. I
Yeah.
kind of enjoy this. Kind of enjoy getting up at like 5:30 in the morning when no one else is up and awake, and, you know, driving to the gym or whatever the heck you do. Like, I used to have that kind of lifestyle. I don't anymore, but there was a certain kind of pleasure in it.
Yeah.
And that's something I never thought I'd find there.
Yeah, and there is something too about like, you know, you feel like you're getting ahead, especially here in America, right? You're like, oh, okay, I'm awake before all these people, I'm doing all these things, and then that was one of the best feelings. I've never worked out like regularly besides like the one time I joined this at work. We had a gym, and one of my friends went to the boot camp every morning, and so I started going to that boot camp with him, and it was 6 o'clock, and I was like. So I would go to this boot camp, work out, which is, again, something I never did. I never been a gym kind of guy. I know, big surprise.
Ooh, wait. So, put those away. It's not that kind of show.
For those of you who are audio only, my muscles are very big. And shh, they don't know. Shh, they can't see. And I started going to that, and it was cool because, you know, one, I was working out, two, I was spending a little time with my friend and also seeing him in a different context, which was fun. And then I was meeting these other people and meeting some people at work that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was hard to beat that feeling when I sat down at my desk earlier I sat down at my desk earlier than I would normally get there before I started working out, and I had already worked out for the day and showered. And it's like, it's hard. And you have all those, you know, endorphins and chemicals that are released. And you're sitting there, you're like ready to go. And there's still not that many people in the office. Is like, that was a hard feeling to beat. And that's a great way to start the day. Almost as good as watching Hopeful for Life's What the Hell is Water?
Oh, man, that's the best way to start the day.
Oh, yeah.
While you're working out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, of course. You know, coming back to this idea of quitting, though, is that, of course, you're not doing that now. So at some point, something switched. And whatever that habit was, as good as it made you feel, you're no longer doing it.
Yeah. So let's transition to, well, real quick, I wanted to make sure to mention, you know, I've only quit one job, which was the last one I had before I did this entrepreneur thing. And for me with quitting, I was obviously thinking about, you know, income, stability. I was thinking about possibilities of things I could do. And I was also thinking about, all right, now I've done this work and I've been able to get ahead financially because Danielle and I, we both grew up upper middle class, so we were fortunate in that way, and we both went to school, came away with no student debt, which was, again, awesome, and we're very grateful to have that. And through scholarships and all that kind of stuff. And then we were able to get jobs, and we there was a term that I didn't hear until after we got out of school, which is DINK. Have you heard the DINK term before?
No.
Dual income, no children.
Oh,
DINC.
yeah. Okay, I guess that's
They're
we
dinks.
are.
Makes sense. Because you got two incomes, and in our case, they both happen to be pretty good incomes, and we did a pretty good job of not letting our expenses scale with our income. We lived a pretty relatively frugal life. Obviously depends on your spectrum on if you would agree with us, right? But of course, we were able to go do the fun things that we wanted to do, and save a whole bunch of money. And that was a nice thing about being a dink. And that was a big part of when I was making that quitting decision was I had the privilege and the ability to say, like, all right, I have this money, this nest egg that I can fall back on. And so another thing about quitting is support systems. What support systems you have in place, and I also had a very good, strong network of friends and family that could help me. If everything went to hell in a handbasket, and this whole helpful for life stuff burned up, and nothing ever came of it, all that type of stuff. Like, realistically speaking, I wouldn't be that bad off. So for me, that quitting was a lot easier than it is for some other people. And, a lot of people are like, oh, you're so brave and, good. I could never do that and things like that. And it's like, well, for one, yes, thank you. I'm friends with Superman. And the other one is
Talk about a good safety net.
Right, exactly. But the other one is just knowing that, hey, yeah, my situation's a little different than some other people's. Like, yeah, that decision's a little harder to make, and I can't say that I would make this same decision if the factors were different, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of it as well. So we talked about jobs, and we started to transition a little bit to habits. What are there any habits that you've either bad or good that you've quit?
I tried smoking a little bit in college.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It was something that
The
like,
cool
my
kids
friends
were
were
doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just go hang out by the dumpsters, smoke cigarettes, which didn't stick with me. And it was funny as well that one of the reasons was because it smelled so bad, and I was just like, I don't like that. And so there's some funny things like that I've quit. When we're talking about habits, there's eating habits, things like that were different. One point I got way into health, and so when I'm talking about eating habits, I was eating way too healthy, and actually got down below like 5% body fat for a while.
Wow.
And was like, I couldn't even get registered on certain machines. It wouldn't register my body fat, which was unhealthy.
Yeah.
But I became fixated, and almost having like a sort of a backwards disorder. I was running all the time, biking, doing triathlon stuff, and just like my body just started wasting away.
Interesting.
And I was just like a loop, like a treadmill that I had gotten stuck on, and I just stayed
Well,
there.
it was a treadmill, and then you were swimming, and then you were also cycling.
There was actually a huge aquarium on a treadmill with a bicycle.
A stationary bike underwater.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. That's what a triathlon is.
Doing all of it at once. Yeah. And so that was in my mid 20s, early 20s, I guess. And so there's these kind of moments that it's just sort of like you realize that this is not healthy. It has the appearance of something, some sort of constructive achievement, but it's not going anywhere. And this is actually bad for me. And so that's kind of a bizarre reverse example of quitting something that seemed good but was actually better for me to quit it.
So how did you know? Like, when, I mean, was there a moment where it's like, okay, or was it like a bunch of little things where it's like, all right, maybe not, and then it was like, what? Or like, what was that like?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to get maybe a little personal here, but there was moments where like my family was concerned about me, didn't know how to approach me, talk to me. I was turning into a pretty angry, negative person. Like my entire life became fixated around this very routinized moments.
Was it you on that Snickers commercial?
Wait,
hungry? Need a Snickers? You're you when you're hungry.
yeah. Except for I wouldn't eat a Snickers, right? Because it had like sugar in it or something.
You're right.
You
Dang
know? It was like
how dare you offer me that Snickers?
Here's a bowl of oatmeal. No, it's processed oatmeal. I can't. Yeah,
I'll just chew these leaves.
I know. It was like some bark over here.
Yeah. No, so didn't mean to step on your personal moment there, but
it was whatever.
Yeah.
So there was kind of a moment where I was invited to go on a trip to Europe, and I was like, no, I've given so much of myself to this current like routine and maintenance of these things, and I was so scared to leave that routine for an amazing opportunity that I mean, I remember my mom basically having to sit me down and just be like, what are you so afraid of? Like, why would you not do this? This is a great thing, and your current thing is not leading you anywhere good. And it was just kind of this sort of emotional breakdown moment. And then after that breakdown, then it was like, oh, okay, I guess I need to start living. Because what I was doing was some sort of semblance. It was a robotic kind of avoidance of the world.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think what it sounds like was like, hey, you had this ideal of this way that you thought you should live, the what you wanted to live, and you were working towards that. And I don't know if you got like tunnel sighted or whatever, but that was the thing you were focusing on and you were doing it. And then it sounded like you were gripping onto it for dear life. And it's like, hey, this is what I need. This is what I'm going to do. This is, and it sounds like maybe that was the most highly structured time of your life, maybe.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And so much of that was about control. And control, oftentimes, need for control comes from fear. And I think a lot of it for me was the world not working the way I thought the world was supposed to work. I didn't know what else to do with myself. So, yeah, there was a whole lot of psychological sort of issues that led to that moment. And we're not going to get into all of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, but there is something really kind of, I don't distressing about being caught in that cycle. But once you're in that cycle, you can't see outside of it. And there's something else about starving yourself where your brain doesn't process information the same. It's almost a survival function. And your brain actually kind of locks itself up and is sort of unwilling to go other directions. A lot of it is calorie deficit. And so, there's some interesting things about that, because you can also talk about money scarcity kind of operates in the same way, that you don't make the right decisions whenever you're under these kind of scarcity conditions.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a couple things. One, talking with Alexandra many times about how she's talking about when you need to make kind of logical decisions, especially if they're in her case, a lot of times we're talking about numbers, but it doesn't have to be numbers. Like if you're making an important decision, especially if it's an emotional one, like a lot of times what you need to do is you need to step out of that situation and you make that decision outside of it. And that's a little hard to step outside of your hunger or deprivation to be able to make those decisions, right?
Yeah.
So kind of made me think of that. And then it also made me think about the upcoming cohort that we're going to have. And I wanted to make sure to mention it because we're talking about relationships with food and how you had one that in theory was good, but too much of a good thing can be bad, right?
Yeah.
And so that helps me think of the upcoming cohort we have coming up about changing your relationship with food. And on Friday, this upcoming Friday, we actually have a guest. We'll be talking about that. So I wanted to make sure to mention a couple of things. And then the other thing that I heard in there that I wanted to make sure to point out was the value of having an outside view on you, right?
Yeah.
As you're trying to make any of these quitting decisions. And, maybe one of the things, and this might end up turning into our challenge for the day, we'll see what comes up in the rest of the episode, but maybe that's a good step for people to take is asking people around them, like, hey, what are some things you think I should quit?
Man, yeah, and that's a brave move. Because if they're honest with you, it's probably going to be the thing you least want to quit.
Yeah, or it's something that you think is very important.
Yes.
Or it's something that you have value in and things like that. And so I definitely want to caution the viewers, like as you're doing this, like go in expecting them to tell you in a bad way, to hurt your feelings, and to have a whole bunch of light bulbs be shattered. Like and recognize like, hey, if you're someone who's very sensitive to these types of things and you're like, oh, this is going to spiral me, it's not good to do, then maybe scope the question, right? Mm-hmm. And say, hey, I've been wondering when it comes to my job, is there something that you think would be good for me to quit with that job? Mm-hmm. And note that it doesn't mean you have to quit the job itself, but maybe some of the practices around it. Like, yeah, I think it might be valuable for you to quit coming home and complaining about it all the time, because every time you complain about it, you give it more credence. It takes up more space in your brain. It puts you in that negative state. Yep. And guess what? That also rubs off on me and everyone around you. So yeah, maybe we could work on quitting that part. Or maybe it's like, hey, what's something around food that you think I should quit? And you can scope that down if you want. Or you can take the, the shotgun approach, but just have that expectation and don't get mad and don't lash out at the person when they then tell you the things because you came and asked the question, right?
Yeah, that's a fairly common response though. Is to ask the question, get the response that you didn't want, and then be angry about it, and then that means that then in the future people won't tell you the truth,
Right.
because they realize that you don't actually want it.
Right.
And so that's one of the difficult things, is one of the reasons it's scary, is because if you actually do want the truth, then it's going to be tough to take. Usually, if it's a profound truth, if it's something like, well, you know what, you need to wash your socks more often.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not going to bother you.
Yeah. Maybe
But-
it's you need to stop smoking 5 packs a day.
Yeah,
I don't know.
you're like, well, I kind of knew that
Yeah.
already. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that would be a great thing for people to do. Even if you're someone who thinks you got everything under control, all great, everything's perfect, like I would argue maybe that's the best time to ask, like, hey, you're maybe missing something, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's kind of interesting little area to get stuck in, is how we look outside of ourselves, right? And who we go to, because of course we're part of a society and a community. And so when you're going to do these kind of things, I mean, you can take some courses in it. Of course, we're going to be listening to a book about crucial conversations and
Yes.
how to have these conversations. And if you want to delay asking this question for a little bit, then
That's definitely possibly a very good thing to do.
yeah, and we'll kind of walk through at least some ideas that come out of this book, and that might give you some pathways or gateways to ask these questions. Because I would say that me coming out of that difficult time for myself was very emotionally painful.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like, be aware. However, the other idea is that, are you going to be a better person on the opposite side of it?
Even if it is hard, even if it is difficult.
Yeah,
right?
short-term pain for long-term reward. That's something that our brains aren't often good at.
Yeah, I'd say they're very often not that great at that, especially in America, and especially in this quick, society where we want all the things and we want it now, right? The magic pill. And so that's another thing that as you're asking this question, if you do decide to ask this question, you can also let the person know, like, hey, I'm going to do my best to not like react and get emotional and get mad and lash out at you. But I want to make sure you're aware that, that's something that may happen. And oh, by the way, if we start getting too far down that emotional path, let's step away. Let's take a break.
It's fine.
It's perfectly fine. Like, this is a question that we're asking, and if you are getting emotional, then maybe that's a sign to, hey, this is a really important conversation for us to have. So let's step away, and then we can come back to it later. And later doesn't have to be like in 30 minutes, right? It could be days or weeks.
Yeah,
or
you could do sort of a weekly thing as well with somebody. I've been kind of thinking more about that. Is one way to help yourself is to set yourself up with some sort of accountability and mentorship program. But we're really kind of circling around the idea of quitting things, and I think what we're trying to talk about is, like, sometimes quitting good things quitting bad things or good things requires a kind of a proactive effort on your part.
Mm-hmm.
So you really got to kind of take a look around, maybe involve other people in it, and all those things can be difficult because I think we often, especially with our bad habits, we really try to hold those to ourselves.
Yes.
And play them down, act like maybe they don't have as much control of us as they do.
Or that they're not as big of a deal. And also, oh, by the way, like, we present to our friends and our family like our ideal selves, right? And it's like, hey, every time someone comes over, my house is very clean. And, little do they know, I live in absolute filth every time someone's not here, right? And that's just one very visual example. But it's like, oh, yeah, I'm always a happy-go-lucky person. But little do they know, like, with my spouse or my siblings or whoever's around me more often, like, I'm a dick, and I just get angry real quick. But like when I'm in fun mode and I'm hanging out with friends, like, yeah. And so that could be some good conversations to have and some good things to be thinking through. Another thing you could do is not just have that with one person, but maybe have a couple of people who you love and you care about, and they love and care about you when you have that conversation, so they can kind of help, like, play off each other and not in like, oh yeah, you should do that, definitely, but like, hey, look, I recognize this is a hard conversation for us to have, so I brought you two here to kind of help me through this. And and if one person is kind of telling you, like, you really need to do this, and then the other person can kind of help, be like, whoa, let's pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, that middle
right?
child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that we talked about there was the outside view. So we're going to get to that in a little bit when we talk about therapy. But the last thing I wanted to make sure to talk about was before getting there was talking with people. We're talking about people and quitting people.
Yes.
Have there been times where you've intentionally quit somebody, if you will, where you're like, hey, I've decided, and obviously, respect people's privacies and things like
Yeah,
that, but
yeah.
it's like, hey, I've decided, I no longer want that person in my life, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like this person is a toxic source, but maybe they're just not like taking me the places I want to go or do the things I want to do, or maybe it's just like, like they've kind of been around for a while just because they've always been around, but maybe that's just not where I'm going to invest my energy. And like, sure,
Yeah.
maybe we see each other every now and then, that's fine, but I'm not going to spend my extra time and energy to try and further that relationship.
Yeah, no, I think that's I've done it with several people, and it's interesting. I really only have one person from high school that I still talk to, and then there's also people I have worked for in the past who I realize at some point the relationship turned, and you just go, nope, I don't need to do this anymore. So there's client relationships, there are, personal, there's something about long-term relationships, somebody from like high school or
Right.
elementary school that you feel like this is very, very important and I need to hang on to it just because of the length of the relationship. And then at some point you're like, nope, this person has really nothing to offer in this space anymore, and you can actually let them go. And that's, I don't know. I know that we're in a society where I've bumped into people before and actually know a couple people who are diehard. Their whole thing is loyalty. And just like, I'm a loyal person. I stick with people. It doesn't matter what they do. I'm on team them. And they just lock down into that mode. And that's their mechanism by which they judge themselves as a good person and a good friend. I don't believe in that mechanism for myself.
Yeah.
So I really do gauge, the benefits of the person and who they're with and their heart and things like that. And I try to look at a lot of different things and also see how it's going to work with me and play off of me. And there are people that are energy vampires. We've been watching what we do in the shadows.
Nice.
Yeah, and Colin Robinson, like he's an energy vampire.
Guillermo!
And so he just talks until he sucks
hilarious.
all your energy out, and I'm just like, and there's so many people that do that, and then there are honest to God, like, not just energy vampires, but yeah, like emotional vampires they always show up with drama. They always tell you how much they need you, and they get you involved in their stuff, and your life becomes worse. And you're caught up in their drama. And the interesting thing is, if you cut them off, they will go find somebody else to feed on.
Yes.
And so this is a fascinating thing, because all of a sudden your life gets better, and you're like, oh well, I wasn't a good friend to that person. I'm sorry, but that friend wasn't a good person to you either, right? Like the relationship has to work both ways.
Yeah. No, and as you're here, we're talking about quitting people, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that I think about, and I hear a little bit in the things you're saying, which is, okay, in some ways, like, how much is me helping this person like worth me paying my lumps or dealing with that pain and struggle, and then also like, where's that person going to go next, and is that going to be bad for this other third party, or will this person who I'm quitting like spiral out of control and things like that? They're on one hand, like, it's very good and valuable to be like, hey, not my problem, right? And that's a tough thing for a lot of people to do, especially if they're people pleasers, and they want people to like them, and they want people to be happy and all that type of stuff. Like, that's a hard thing to do, right? But also some of it is, where are you personally at when you're trying to do this quitting, right? Because if you're in a super solid place and everything's great, you're firing all cylinders, like, maybe you can tolerate a little bit more energy sucking, and maybe you have a little bit more energy to help deal with all these people's problems and the drama that they always bring up that you don't care about, all these types of things. And maybe you can, take that suffering, if you will, that vampire, if you will. But especially if you're not all the way there, like, maybe that's a good sign, like, hey, you know what, like, I just need to focus a little more on me and putting the people in my life that are going to help me, right? There's the whole phrase, like, you will become, or you are the 5 people that you spend the most time with. Which, is something that I think has a lot of truth to it, right? And frankly, in my opinion, like, if you're designing your ideal, you should try and find some people and incorporate them into your life on a regular basis. Some people who are ahead of you in some aspect, right?
Yeah.
And some people who are like behind you, and some people who are kind of in it with you.
Yes.
I think there's value in that, in each of those relationships, right? Where the person ahead of you is helping you, you're kind of helping the person behind you, you and the person who are in it together, like going through it, you know, in the trenches. So I think that is kind of one view I like to look at as I'm dealing with people. And if you examine the people in your life, the relationship you have, and they're all, you know, one of those, then maybe that's a good time to, you know, shake it up a little bit and try and diversify it.
It's an excellent point. I never hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I think that yeah, you should both have a mentor who's ahead of you and then a mentee as well, somebody that you're helping out along the way. And I've kind of heard that a lot in sort of career situations, but hadn't thought about it as much in the friendship context, and that makes a lot of sense.
So I think we could talk about, you know, quitting people for much longer, but we're near the end of our time here, and I want to talk about quitting therapy. We have a couple more minutes, or should we save that for another day?
You know, let's go ahead and get into it. I mean, we're already here.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's sort of jump into it because I think we've touched on some of the aspects of it as well. Yeah, so I was just telling Reed this morning that I have stopped going to therapy for a brief period of time. I assume it'll be a few months, and then I'll things will start percolating back up, and I'll need some insight from the kind of therapy I've been doing is group therapy. So I'm in a cohort of 5 to 6 people, maybe 7, and the therapist sort of helps us sort of keep the conversation moving, and we talk through things. And what is kind of fascinating about that is sort of matching up your sort of weird picadillos or dramas with other people's and letting them respond to things, and you get multiple viewpoints. You have some people that will stick up for you, and you have other people who will call you out on stuff.
Nice.
And at the same point you end up sticking up for and calling out people on other things too. And if you're just nice all the time, they'll call you out on being nice all the time, and so it's a pretty, because of, I think that it's almost a family dynamic that you build where it is a bit of a safe zone, but it's like a painful safe zone. And so one of the things that's kind of nice about that is that it can actually be more honest and open than your actual family.
Yeah.
And that's something that I maybe I kind of knew that could exist, but this is the first time in a long time that I've had it. So it was really beneficial for me.
Yeah, and there's something really special about doing something with a group of people, because there's so much learning that happens in the in between, and
Yes.
from I'm learning from them, and I don't know how your group therapy work, but a lot of times you have like the spot where everyone's talking, and then sometimes you have maybe some side conversations, and if it's in person, like this could be the coffee and the cookies before and after. If you're on a Zoom, sometimes there's literally breakout meetings where you're like, all right, y'all have a partner where you guys discuss, or you have a small group where you guys discuss this. There's of course many different ways it can be done. But yeah, there's just so much you can learn from the things other people are going through. And there's also a lot of value in having it and seeing it in someone else's life, right? Where you don't have the stake in that game.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, dang, Susie, like you're being controlling. Like, why are you doing that? Poor Joe. Like,
Yeah.
can you not see that? And then you're like, wait a second.
Yeah. It's pretty fun because a lot of times when you speak up in therapy at all, it's interesting because it can become adversarial. I think if it's just you and the therapist, you can think it's just their point of view. But when you're in this group and you bring up some point, and then as soon as you speak, you realize, oh, I'm revealing more about myself than I am about them or their situation. I'm angry about their situation because it's hooked my own shit
Right.
is one of the phrases that we've used. So hooking your own stuff basically means that it's pulling out some sort of reaction, something that's traumatic for you, that's deep inside of you. So when you see somebody else talking about something and like you go off on their husband for being a jerk or whatever, and you go, oh, that's me talking. That's not actually their husband.
Right.
And that's their relationship, and I'm putting my own relationship onto theirs. And so there's
Projecting.
this fascinating thing that you kind of... So, yeah, I've enjoyed therapy. I've been doing it a little over a year now. Learned a whole lot, just a whole lot. And, yeah, I've actually decided to quit for a while.
Yeah. So when it... First off, I guess, what was the impetus? What was making you say like, hey, I should think about quitting, or I need to quit?
I think it's because I keep circling around the same issues without like the issues seem to be getting kind of like smaller and more condensed and sort of more actionable. And then what ends up happening too is talking about the same thing over and over again, just coming back and doing replays and little check-ins, and not really digging for like an extra level of depth. And so I was kind of going like, oh, I must be sort of like emotionally at like plateauing here. Like I'm not digging deeper anymore. I'm just trying to maintain a status quo. And I just was thinking to myself that if I'm trying to just maintain, then maybe this is not the time. Maybe I
Mm-hmm.
need to give myself some time to process what I've learned over the last year, to sort of actualize and realize this and level off until there is a time where I'm ready to start digging again.
Yeah, and that's the thing about therapy is that it can come and go in waves, and that's perfectly fine. The main message I would have for people with therapy is don't quit it before you really get into it. I think that's a really common approach. Is people don't do it, they resist it, they resist it, they resist it, and then finally they do it, and then they go to like 1 or 2 sessions, and then they call it quits. That is a time where I firmly say I do not think that is the best choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I can't say that blanket statement because I don't know everyone's situation. But in general, I do not think that's the best choice. You should need to try a different therapist, different type of therapy. Like maybe you've done individual, maybe you should try group, maybe you've done in person, maybe you should try virtual. Maybe there's all of these different things, and there's different types of oh, maybe you should try CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe you
Yeah.
should try these various different approaches. And frankly, maybe the people you've been involved with that are trying to help you, maybe they're just trash because it's easy to forget, but therapists are people too. And
Yeah.
there's different people who are, one, just better and worse at their jobs, just like any other job. Two, they vibe with you more or less just based off personality traits and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, yeah, maybe they have some traits that are negatively triggering you. Maybe, for example, you have a fear of being judged, whether or not you realize it, and you go to a therapist and they're very judgy, then, and they try and suppress it, but it comes out in all these little small ways, and you notice every single small one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's not doing the thing it needs to do for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you was, okay, so now you've done it, and
Yeah.
I want to point out, you said you did it for every week for a year, which is a lot. That is a very long, significant amount of time. Do you think, having developed some skills and learned some things, like, did that help you feel better about this whole quitting process, or was that related to the thought process at all,
Mm.
or not really?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of times I wanted to quit because of the emotional distress, the
The friction.
the friction showing up in the group, having to talk through things I didn't want to deal with, didn't want to look at. That was so. There was times I wanted to quit for those reasons, and I knew that those were not the right reasons to quit. So at some point, gaining enough self-awareness that you can understand a little bit about why you're reacting the way you're reacting, watching these kind of feelings show up of like of thinking about quitting but not having it be fear-based, not having it be running away, having it be this kind of idea of like I'm going to maybe try to be stable on my own for a while and see how this works. It's almost, it feels more along the lines of a baby bird that's trying to like trying to
Yeah,
fly.
or like a bicycle that you took the training wheels off of, or whatever.
Yes, yeah. So there becomes a point where I know you can be in therapy for life, and a lot of people are, and I don't think there's anything at all wrong with that. We've talked about it before about being maintenance, like going to a dentist, doing these kind of things.
Changing your oil,
Changing your you just
preventative
gotta
maintenance.
gotta stay after these kind of things and stay on top of it. At the same point, then there's a I think there's sort of emergency circumstances sometimes that it I think got me into therapy when I was having a lot of emotional problems. And then you kind of work through a lot of things. You're like, okay, well let's try this without the training wheels for a while. And what I'm assuming will happen is that the some other more underlying deep issues will start showing up over the next 3 to 4 months as I start sort of getting back into my normal life and things start coming along, and I'll get this energy again to actually start digging and to really jump into some other ideas. So that's kind of what I think will happen. But a lot of that insight comes from going to therapy
Yeah.
for a year. I don't think I would have had that previously. Previously, I was locking down all those impulses and becoming more automaton. Like I was becoming like a robot. Just you will just get these things done, and you will not pay attention to those emotions.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it a little bit in the past, but self-awareness, right, is extremely important, and being able to have that self-awareness, and you've now developed that skill, at least to an extent, to be able to look at yourself and see and know, like, all right, hey, here's when I'm not in the best spot. Here's when I'm something's going on, and no, now I have some of the tools, some of the techniques, some of the frameworks to when these things happen, now I have a couple of steps I can take to help shift it back towards where we want it to be. And then also, you mentioned you did group therapy, but you may also have some other people in your life who have been with you on this journey, whether they're some of these strangers, or maybe there's some people close to you that have gone through this with you and can help you along the way, and they know some of the things you've been struggling with, and they can help see some of those things, like, hey, it looks like you're going into that one thing that you always tend to do. Like, I just want to let you know from the outside, I'm starting to see that. Like, what are the steps you're taking to make sure that doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, and part of it is keeping in touch with some of the people from group, and once again surrounding yourself with a couple of friends, and then trying to be sort of open with them without burdening them too much at the same time. And then that's fascinating, because most of your really good friends don't see that as a burden at all.
But there is a correct way, and I say a correct way. There is a better ways to talk with people about your issues than not. And that was one thing I learned in my emotional fitness class I took last year. And so we'll talk separately about that, because I think it's a really important thing, of how you come to someone with an issue or a problem without burdening them too much or putting them in a bad, uncomfortable spot or things like that. So they can best help you, and you can best have that good relationship, right? And so make sure you're not being the vampire, right?
Yeah. And one of the things that you've sort of brought up, this idea of tools, and I think in therapy I continue to talk about things like that. Like, I'm like, well, I've got all these tools now that I can use to live a better life, and this, that, and the other. And it was fascinating to hear the therapist sort of be like, they're not tools. Like, this is emotional growth that came through analyzing and breaking down and feeling things. So there was a tendency, I think, for her to try to unwind me from the ideas of thinking about things in terms of utility. And
which, as admittedly a DIY guy who loves tools,
oh, man,
like, maybe that was a little bit of mapping for you, right?
I was definitely trying to, like, map on to other things, and I think that on occasion she was really good about sort of like trying to steer me away from my current sort of modeling structure, and sort of saying, like, these are emotional things, like, you're thinking of them as solutions, as if they're a function. And there's something fascinating about the idea of, like, of really feeling things, and watching, after you really feel something, then it can disperse. And what's really interesting is, if you don't feel the thing but you keep on working it as a function, then you're working around it, and it will always be there, and then you'll always have to work around it. But there's something different about maybe emotionally feeling something. And so that's just my own sort of premise from this, but we'll see how it plays out over time.
Yeah, it makes me think of that the animated movie about feelings, Inside Out.
Okay.
That's what it was. Have you ever seen that one before?
No, I haven't.
So that's a fun Pixar movie. Came out in 2015, and the main character is, I think her name is Joy. And so she is Joy. And then there's this girl, and it's like, all right, let's look inside of her head and see all of the emotions that are going on. And they're personified in these little characters. And, like, there's Anger, who's a hothead. Of course, his head's on fire and things like that. And I may be messing up the character names, but, sadness and jealousy, all these types of feelings. And it's kind of cool to see it play out, and it's a Pixar film, and so of course it's cute, it's fun, feel good type of stuff, but it's cool to actually see and think about emotions in this way. Like, hey, there's this little person or this little dude going on in there, and, like, here's how he thinks, here's what he values, all that type of stuff. So I just wanted to mention that in case people haven't seen it. You might want to check out Inside Out. So quitting, on the therapy thing, I really appreciate you sharing that part about tools, especially as a guy who very much is, the logical, the rational, like, oh, if X happens, apply Y, then Z will, so it's a good reminder, like, hey, with feelings, not everything's always that logical or easy to do or to map or to fix. The tool isn't going to do it, fix it always for you. And also, there is value in just sitting and examining and working through those emotions, especially if you're doing it with the guidance of someone who does this all the time with all sorts of people and has seen all the types of things that and ways this can show, and they can use their own tool belt and things like that to help guide you through those emotions and help you work through those, because I think that's the big thing is people suppress a lot.
Yeah, we're taught to.
Yeah.
Which is wild unto itself. But
Yes. And yesterday Danielle and I were watching Queer Eye. Are you familiar with that show?
No, not really.
So there's the full name is, or at least originally was, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy.
I mean, yeah, I
I'll just give the premise is, and so you have basically there's a straight dude who needs some sort of makeover or life transformation, and I don't know it from the origin, so I don't know how much it's changed and shifted over the years. But now at least it's these 5 gay guys. They're called the Fab Five, I believe, and each one of them has a different kind of specialty. One of them's food, one of them's design, like for the home and stuff like that. One of them's like clothes. One of them's kind of like emotions and relationships, and I think I'm missing one, but the main point is they have all these different facets, and each one of them has their little vignette with the person where like, oh, we're going to go work on this, or I'm going to go, redo your house, and oh, let's cook together. So, there's some aspect of food involved, and maybe even sharing that with some people. And it's like this whole intervention type of show where people submit applicants for like, hey, here is the person that needs this, right? And so they come and they do this thing. Well, the Fab Five has come to Texas, which is great because it's like, all right, 5 gay dudes come to Texas, and it's like, I got to at least see what happens.
Yeah.
And so this is a show, I don't know if my wife's watched all of them, but she's watched a good chunk of them. And especially over the last couple of years, I've seen a handful of them here and there. Somewhere between 5 and 20, if I had to guess. And so we watched one yesterday on Texas. I was like, all right, this is cool and interesting. And they went to Austin, and there's this lady who...
is that Texas?
Yeah,
oh,
I know, right? I was like, okay, safe choice. Go to Texas first, or go to Austin
go to
first.
The most California part of Texas.
Right. But so I'm curious to see where the other ones go. Like, hopefully they go to some like small rural town and be like, all right, Texas. But yeah, so it was cool to see because the lady was a grandma, and she ran a honky tonk place, and she was wearing like short shorts and deep cut shirts and like super sexualized, and people were like, grandma, like put on some clothes. And it was cool to watch her because she had all these things and these fears, and one of her fears was being judged. And she was like, I'm confident in me, and I like being me, and I don't care that other people don't want me to be this way or whatever. And again, she kind of like tightened her vice grip down on that, and then some of the people around her who loved her were like, hey, we didn't want you to be you, but maybe you don't need to be that version of you anymore. Maybe you shifted and changed it a little bit, right? And I'm oversimplifying right here, but the getting to the point where she could understand that, and some of the people in her life could talk with her about that, and recognizing like, hey, there's that fear of judgment there. That is a big step. And judgment is something we're going to have another episode on because I think it's a really big thing, but we're going to have to wrap up today because we could go on forever. So any last thoughts before I kind of go to recap?
No, let's rock through the recap. But yeah, the judgment thing. Ooh, boy.
Yeah. That's a very big one, and definitely want to talk about that one because it's huge. As you mentioned, like we've been judging all our lives, and it's a very troublesome things that leads to a lot of bad behaviors. So for today, we started out talking about quitting, and we finished up talking about quitting. So that makes it nice for the recap. We were talking about quitting, but we talked about it through a lot of different lenses. We talked about it, what's it like, or what's it mean when you quit a job? What's it like or mean when you quit a habit? And what's it like when you quit some people? And then we also talked a little bit about what it means to quit therapy. And we really appreciate you opening up and sharing what that personal situation was like for you. I know that's very, being vulnerable is a very strong trait to have, and it's tough, especially as a Texan man. So I really appreciate you doing that, Ryder. And as we talked about, jobs, we talked about, okay, there's the reality of how are you able to do it, and what are the opportunities available. If you quit, who knows what may come of it. There are a lot of benefits and a lot of things that could come. We talked about the value of moving sideways or maybe even moving down to open up other doors or to do different things. And also, I didn't mention it earlier, but as you're moving down, maybe it's just within the same company, within the same job. It's like, you know what? I just want a little bit less responsibility, a little bit less
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and I'll accept a little bit less money because where I am in my life, like, and maybe that's the only quitting you need to do is like, hey, I just need to quit part of this job or whatnot. And then we talked about, okay, we briefly touched on, is there a thing about quitting too late? And maybe if like all of the bells are ringing and you're like, finally, I definitely absolutely need to quit. Like, well, okay, well, how can we maybe move that quitting timeline earlier if that is maybe healthy for somebody? We talked about having a support network, and we talked about the reality of, yes, having money available can certainly help, but having family and friends and people around you as you're quitting can help make things a lot better. We talked about when it came to habits, one of the things we said is, hey, maybe one of the most valuable things for you to get is an outside view, and that is dealing with maybe it's a significant other or a spouse or something like that, or maybe it's a friend or family member or a therapist. And then when we came to people, we talked about, hey, I know loyalty is an important trait, especially for a lot of people, and that can be hard when it comes to quitting because you're like, I'll never quit you, and to reference Brokeback Mountain again. And then you're like, well, loyalty is one value, but there are other things to consider as you're quitting people. And we talked about, we referenced what's the name of that show again? Something about shadows.
Oh, what we do in the shadows.
What We Do in the Shadows, which is a show you guys should check out. It's funny. It's like a mockumentary type of thing. There's also a movie about it, by the way, that started as a movie and then turned into a show.
Yeah, it's on Hulu right now if you're looking for it.
Awesome. And there's a character in there. What's his name?
Colin Robinson.
Colin. Yeah, Colin Robinson. He's a vampire, but he's an energy vampire, and he saps people by. He wears a sweater vest. He's a typical kind of like white collar worker that's white and coffee mug, and he sits there and talks about all these various things.
He talks about things until it bores people so
Yes.
badly, like he just sucks all their energy.
And that's
out
how
of
he
them.
gets his life force,
Yeah.
which is just a great concept. And I'm sure some of you can probably relate to who that person might be. And then we talked about with people, maybe, when you're talking about, hey, the 5 people that you spend the most time with or who you're going to be, maybe becoming or things like that. And we talked about, one, just thinking about that and examining, and then also thinking like, okay, maybe I can try and find someone who's ahead of me and someone who's behind me, and then also someone who's kind of in the same spot as I am. And that also, by the way, that depending on how you slice it, ahead of, behind, that could be way wide different variety of things. At Helpful for Life, especially, we're aware of all these things. You could be a great cook but a horrible husband, or you could be an amazing business person but not know your finances at all. So we're talking about ahead of and behind. Like, there's a lot of different ways to measure that, quote unquote. And then we ended up by talking about therapy, and when Ryder himself quit therapy, and maybe some of the things that you guys can think about as you're deciding if therapy is something you should quit. And we also talked about, hey, maybe there's different types of therapies, and if you are going to quit, maybe there are some guardrails you should put up. And also, if you quit therapy, you can always go back, right? So that's another thing.
I mean, I'm thinking about that as inevitable.
Right.
The going back is just like, oh, no, this is just now part of my life.
Yeah, and I don't think we touched on it in the segment, but I want to make sure to add on the point that, hey, the fact that you were doing this every week, it's great that you are examining, and you talked a little bit about, hey, there's going to be some times when I'm going to have that energy and drive and desire to dive a little deeper into an issue, and there's going to be some times where it's like I'm going to back off, and that's perfectly fine. And so I want to make sure to point out, like, hey, if you're doing something every week and you're putting you're taking off that scab and you're exposing that wound, like, there is pain and friction and struggle and emotion involved with that. And so it's okay for that to come in bursts, like, hey, all right, I'm going to do that for a few months here or maybe a year there, and then I'm going to, take off a little bit and then see how things go, and then we can come back, especially if things get worse. Or, hey, if things are really going great, you can always come check in and see how things are going, what's working for you, so you can do more of those types of things. All right, and then our challenge for today, which I'll say in one second. Any other last things you wanted to add to the recap?
No, sounded good.
All right, cool. So the challenge for today is to ask someone in your life, hey, is there something that you think I should quit? And as we talked about when we gave this challenge, we gave a lot of caution flags on how you ask this, when you ask this, and the person you're asking, and giving some being careful to make sure that you're not setting you or that person up for failure. Like, we recognize that quitting, and if someone says, hey, you really need to quit being this, and that's like a core part of your identity, like, that could be a really tough conversation to have. So make sure to not step into that one too lightly, and maybe you want to have a couple people people there. Maybe you want to start off by saying like, hey, I've got this challenge where I got to see, about quitting some things. And I recognize this could get really emotional. So I just want to make sure you're aware, and I accept what you have to say. And if I lash out, it's not at you, it's because I'm trying to deal with it, things like that. And then also recognizing if things do get heated, literally step away. They're like, okay, thank you so much for telling me that. I'm going to go, on a walk. I'm going to process and start dealing with some of that. All right. And so that was our challenge for today. Any other last thoughts, Ryder, before we send us off?
Oh, no. I mean, last thoughts. Sounds like, death coming on. Final words.
Well,
just jump into the, I don't like the quitting thing. Just like examine your motivations. I think that's a key point, to just keep examining things, write them down, sit with them.
And if you have something that you're just really, really clenching on, whether or not you realize it, recognize that you're really clenching on it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that is a thing that you want to. As you examine your motivations, you realize that is something that I want to be really gripping onto. But maybe it's like, hey, well, I didn't realize just how tightly I was gripping that, and I was maybe blind to these downsides to it. So the last thing I wanted to highlight here, Danielle says, she fixed my quote for me. She said, when God closes a door, somewhere he opens a window. And that's from The Sound of Music. Maybe not the exact quote I was going for, but pretty much along the same lines.
It's tougher to get out of a window, though. I will say.
Not if you've got less than 5% body fat.
I know. You're just like grease me up, slide through like nail.
Exactly. Well, with that, everyone, have a wonderful day, and we will see you tomorrow.